All right. Good morning. I'm Gregory Swinton with MBBJ, and I serve on the NAOP Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Welcome to your Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Review. Thank you so much for joining us for this important panel and discussion. The format of this event is a little different from our normal structure. Our panel will speak for the first hour, during which time we invite you to submit questions in the questions feature to the right. There will be time near the end of the panel for a moderated Q&A, and we may incorporate your audience submissions during the broadcast as the discussion evolves. Instead of pre-webinar networking, we will have our social lounge open after the webinar for 30 minutes of networking and dialogue about the topics we discussed on the panel. Our speakers and DEI committee members will be located throughout the lounge, and we encourage you to start conversations based on your reflections and thoughts about the presentation. Events like these would not be possible without the continued support of our sponsors. So our gold sponsors include DPR Construction, Forum, a Women's Small Business Consortium, Hermanson Company, Holland Partner Group, Hudson Pacific Properties, MG2, Schuert, Skanska, and Stokes Lawrence. Our silver sponsors include Boots Constructions, Ginsler, Investco, LBA Realty, McKinstry, Mortensen, and NBBJ. Bronze sponsors include CallisonRTKL, Coughlin Porter Lundeen, Deck & Kolb Engineers, DWS, LinkedIn, LinkMe LLC, and PSF Mechanical. Now, I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, Stacey Barkley. Stacey is the Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Leader at DPR Construction, leading DEI strategy and working to embed the principles and practices of DEI into business strategies with an emphasis on employee experience and life cycle. Stacey is an accomplished leader with more than 30 years of senior management and executive experience. She has been a staunch advocate and vocal supporter of the employee experience and the importance of DEI as an imperative in the value proposition of companies. Stacey has worked globally to advance cultural competency and literacy, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and social justice. We're excited to have her join us today to moderate this discussion and share her experiences. Stacey?
Thanks so much, Greg, and welcome everyone. I am truly honored to be moderating today's panel discussion and privileged to be with such an amazing group of people. Our panelists today represent a diverse spectrum of the industry, including specialty, organization size, and geography. They have graciously offered to share their perspectives, experiences, and lessons learned, particularly within the context of reflecting on the past 18 months. So allow me to introduce our panelists today. First, we have Dena Yamaguchi from CallisonRTKL. With over 25 years of experience in the architecture and design industry, Dena has a passion for creating innovative experiences in fast-paced environments. As an associate principal at Callison, she is a skilled leader with a broad range of knowledge in the retail, hospitality, and workspace sectors. Next, we have Marie Ternes with Coughlin Porter Lundeen. Marie is a structural engineer and project manager who chose structural engineering due to her desire to positively impact the cities and communities around her. Marie enjoys watching her projects come to life. In addition to leading CPL's internal women's group, she's involved in local and national AEC organizations, including Urban Land Institute's Young Leaders Board, ACE Mentor Programs, and Carew. Rounding out our panel today is Cait Carew with Lake Union Partners. Cait oversees asset management and market research, branding and marketing initiatives, investment partner relations, and has responsibilities for management of the company. Thank you and welcome, panelists. We have a number of questions to cover, and while I will direct them to specific people, I encourage all of our panelists to weigh in. And again, keeping in context, reflecting on the last 18 months or so, I'm going to begin with Marie and then to Cait. What has been your firm's organization's approach to DEI initiatives, design, and programs? Marie.
Thanks. Yeah, so at Coughlin Porter Lundeen, the DE&I efforts really kicked off about 5 or 6 years ago, and it started with ownership here identifying that they wanted more women in leadership. And so we really worked hard, and they established an all-day session where they brought in an outside moderator and had all the women in our office sort of meet and discuss and share ideas. And out of that came a lot of we categorized things into different buckets of areas that we thought could use attention, and ultimately took that to leadership. And then over the course of the next several years, we were able to sort of make some policy changes internally that have really helped our culture. And so that was 5 years ago, and you can notably tell the difference that has made. But thinking about the last 18 months, and we're really starting to change our focus to not just having women in leadership, but wanting to have many more underrepresented folks in our industry. And we're an engineering consulting firm, and so it is always a challenge to have the appropriate representation when it takes specialized training. And so we're kind of in the early phases of sort of opening that up to the broader community.
That's fantastic. There's an old saying about a rising tide raises all ships. So even when you start with one particular group, you uplift all groups in that process. And so being able to lift and land other programs and initiatives across the spectrum of people is really important. Cait.
Yeah, so for us, I think it's at 2 levels. So we are a small development company based in Seattle. So when we think about our DEI initiatives, it's both at the project level, and then it's obviously at our company level. So we want to focus to some extent on what we are good at, and what we are good at is developing projects. So, we build in urban areas. Our goal from the beginning of our company has been, how do we create economic opportunity, specifically around women and minority-owned small businesses? Typically, these are the businesses that go in the ground floor retail of our buildings. So, the second building that we ever completed was 100% women-owned businesses at the ground floor. We've learned, and we've, I think, gotten better at doing that. We're focused on how we can help prop up those businesses in sort of to use Greg's term, a culturally competent way. So that's one side of it. And then the other side, I think, is at the company level, right? So we're a super small company. There are currently 15 people in our office. So we're always looking at a balance of how we can have a strong infrastructure and strategic policies in place. But then, given that we're so small, how do we remain nimble? How do we support the people in our office, and how can we be reactionary, right? So we talk about looking back at the last 18 months. One of the things we did, not because it was necessarily a policy we had in place, but because we recognized the impact that the last 18 months were having on people, specifically related to COVID, was, wow, people are really struggling with childcare, particularly women, because their kids aren't in school anymore, right? So we offered a childcare credit to all the people in our office that had school-age kids that were supposed to be in school that were not. So I think we take a lot of pride in being able to react, and I think we're also learning how we can be a little bit more focused on a stronger infrastructure. So it's a balance of both.
No, it's interesting thinking back over certainly the last 18 months, and a conversation we were having just before the presentation started. Sometimes the smaller an organization is, the more nimble they can be by comparison to larger organizations. So, there's this kind of, I'll say, a bit of an advantage to a certain extent to be able to have flexible policies when there may be fewer people involved in the decision-making processes. Oftentimes, the larger an organization gets, the more complex those mechanisms become. So it's really wonderful that you all were able to be so agile so quickly and offer things that oftentimes larger organizations may be more challenged to do because of some of those nuances. I know for DPR, our approach has been both holistic and comprehensive. We prior to the last 18 months, have certainly aspired to embed DEI in the life cycle of the entire employee experience, from talent acquisition to offboarding. And our approach has really attempted to recognize that DEI is not a function, but a practice that lives within the value proposition of an organization. And understanding that while strategies and tactics oftentimes change over time, values don't. And so if your true north always aligns with the value proposition of your organization and DEI is embedded in that value proposition, then it's usually easier to adapt to change that occurs. Thank you both. The next question, I'm going to start with Dena and then go to Marie. What is one of the fundamental goals of your company's DEI efforts?
So at CallisonRTKL, we're a fairly large firm. We're a global architecture firm. We have over 20 offices worldwide. And we've been pretty good about DEI in the past, but it hasn't been very organized. And because we have so many different offices, people are doing all kinds of different things. So one of the things we've really been working on over the past 18 months is to kind of, I think you said earlier, Stacey, before our panel, it's to herd the cats, like herding the cats, getting everybody together. What are we doing? We're not duplicating efforts. Let's all get everybody together. I mean, the overall goal is to create transparency and hold people accountable, right? And that accountability really gives us that feedback loop for the initiatives that we're, putting forth, because it's not just we're one and done, right? This is not a feel-good initiative. This is something that's ongoing, and we have to be transparent. We need to get people involved. And, with a large corporation, you need that sort of corporate voice to help drive it. And so that's our main initiative to keep everything going.
Yeah, transparency and accountability. I love the fact that you raised the accountability aspect, because it really does take both in order to create culture change, transformational change. There's an old adage that if you're not keeping score, it's just practice. So I think there's that accountability piece is really important. Marie, what about your company? What's been one of the primary goals of the DEI efforts?
Yeah, so like I said before, 5 years ago, the goal was to kind of get more women into leadership, and that was a pretty explicit goal. But I think as we continue on and we kind of reevaluate what our next goals are, they're harder and harder to define when you encompass, bringing up more and more people. And it's not, a quota number that we're trying to establish, but it's more about the, retention of the employees that we do have and fostering their growth throughout their careers. So it's really a long-term plan that needs to be, like you were saying, it needs to be embedded in the culture, and it needs to be bought in at all levels. So in some ways, it's hard to establish what a goal is. But in another sense, you kind of can't let your foot off the gas, and you have to sort of let it kind of become a part of the company culture.
No, well said. And Dena, I'm going to go back to you again, talking about that accountability piece. How have you all established how you will measure success?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm really proud to say that as of February of this year, CallisonRTKL has become a certified JUST organization. So this is a certification through the ILFI, and it measures, it's basically a social justice and equity nutrition label, if you will, that's published. It's public, it's on the website, and they measure you against 6 categories and 22 indicators. So it's really helped us, because DEI has really been embedded in our firm for many, many years. It gave us a really good idea and gave us a baseline to measure from. So we knew from this nutrition label, from this JUST label, where we were, what we needed, what we're doing well, and what we needed to work on. And like I said before, it's always a work in progress. And the cool thing about the JUST label is it doesn't just sit stagnant. You have to reapply every 2 years. And as we start moving the needle on things, we can decide to maybe tell them that we've moved the needle on. We just did a whole thing on gender equity and pay. We have this whole Women's in Leadership, just like Marie has, initiative. And that's really moved the needle on how we've looked at the pay gap. So I was, wondering, like, what are we going to wait, for another year or so to tell people that we've sort of closed that gap, or are we going to go ahead and try to get the updated on our label? We're not sure yet, but it's really given us a place to start from and given us some goals to hit later on.
That's fantastic. And yeah, the just label is no small undertaking by any stretch of the imagination. And so, as I said before, if you're not keeping score, it's just practice. And ultimately, people do manage what gets measured. So defining success and establishing measurements is an important component to an overall strategy. And it doesn't have to be a BHAG. It doesn't have to start out that way. But certainly having SMART goals should be foundational to any DEI strategy. So Marie, when you think about starting out with your women's group and how that has really influenced movement of the organization, what strategies did you embark on in the beginning to achieve your goals relative to your women's group?
Yeah, so for the women's group, I think it was about getting everybody in the room and really just starting the conversation and seeing what fell out of it. There was not a whole lot of expectation of what, ownership wasn't necessarily expecting to hear anything specific. But when we came together and like I said, it was a full day session. So the women in our office kind of got together and spent hours together. And we had an outside facilitator moderating and guiding the discussion, but it was really about idea sharing and understanding one another's experiences. And so then a smaller group of us, we were able to kind of consolidate that, 6 to 8 hours of discussion into sort of 5 buckets that we thought could have actionable items to them. And so we ended up bringing suggestions like updates to our parental leave. And one of the big things was just having a good knowledge of career path and knowing what's coming next. And so we kind of created career stepping stones throughout, what you might expect in not just next year at your annual review, but in 5 years from now or 10 years from now. And giving people who don't necessarily see someone who looks like them or acts like them in leadership, but they could still see how they could get there, and sort of opening up communication and being a little bit more transparent about that process. And so those were some of the bigger items that came out. And like you said, I mean, it came from a discussion of the women in our office, but it has impacted the entire office culture. So that's been really great. I think as we move forward, one of the things that we're, having a challenge with is, the pipeline of candidates into our organization. So, as engineers, we're fairly specialized in our education, and there's a limited pool of folks to choose from that have appropriate credentials. And so we're not only identifying what we can do within our company at Coughlin Porter Lundeen, but what we can do to impact the community around us so that there is a more diverse pool to choose from. And so we've started partnering with Rainier Scholars and have established an internship program that we're hoping someone will take us up on next year. But to essentially kind of bring people in from maybe communities that aren't aware of AEC in general, or structural and civil engineering. And we've been partnering with ACE Mentors for a long time, which does very similar work, and they're expanding their DE&I efforts. So we're finding ways to not just impact our internal office, but how we can go out to the community and try to have an impact there as well, so that the whole industry can benefit.
Well, I'm going to pull a couple more of those threads in a moment, but I want to go to Cait, because there's so much when you think about DEI strategies and the various tactics that one can employ. As your firm has approached this work, what have you found are the strategies that have required more planning and adjustment, and certainly anything you want to add on to what Marie just said?
Yeah, well, I think what Marie said is super interesting because, for us at the company level, a lot of it comes down to hiring. And I feel like that's a common thread, and that's a common thread that you hear maybe across industries, but definitely within commercial real estate. And the talent is there, right? It's on us to access it. But I also think specifically in commercial real estate, it's a little bit of a closed environment. And I think there is a perception that either you need to have sort of a rich uncle or your family has to be in commercial real estate, or like I think that we are trying to focus, and I think NAIOP and the DEI committee in general has actually done a really good job with the internship program and with various other programs about presenting commercial real estate as a viable career path and making sure that people are aware of it, right? And you don't have to have a rich uncle to get a job at a development company right out of high school or right out of college. And the other thing I think we need to do a better job of promoting is that I think commercial real estate is really, there is a lot of opportunity because there are so many different career paths into it, right? Specifically when it comes to development. There are architects, people from construction backgrounds, people from more finance background, like it's a really people from leasing or property management. So I think one of the things that we talk a lot about is sort of where do we start that awareness campaign? And we've had debates back and forth about, is it high school? Like, is it, NAIOP did a great program about inviting kind of young high school kids to hear, this is what commercial real estate is, right? So we spent a lot of time thinking about that because the talent is there. It's just making sure that we're accessing it and then also making sure that people see commercial real estate as a viable career path.
And so with that, I'm going to pull that kind of talent acquisition thread for just a moment, because we know kind of across the industry and amongst the affiliates, there is underrepresentation of certain groups. So, and this is to the panel at large, whoever wants to respond. What specifically have your firms done either to augment or tap into different populations that may have been different than their talent acquisition strategies a couple of years ago?
I can speak a little bit to that. I am on a university mentorship program that we have in a university outreach program that's been around for a little bit, but we've really been talking about how do we tap into the HBCUs. And it's been a little bit difficult because perhaps they don't have the programs for architecture that we're finding out. We do offer internships. So the conversation that we were just having the other day, actually last week, is how do we start partnering with those schools and help them start a program? Because I think that historically, like what Cait was saying, real estate, I think we have an issue with being accessible and having people understand that it's open to everybody. It's not, it's kind of, I think people think it's like real estate and architecture to be sort of elitist. And, we need to really work to make that change and to change that perception throughout. And I think it does start, really, I think it really starts with elementary school almost, and making sure that these kids know this is something that's open to you.
Yeah, we're kind of doing a very similar thing, Dena. We're starting with just evaluating where we're at with recruiting. We recruit at kind of the same universities year after year. We get great candidates from them, and they go on to be very successful here. But it is a question of, well, are there untapped resources at these HBCU universities where we can sort of get more diversity from, just bringing people in that wouldn't have otherwise known about us because we never recruited there. And I think to your point, it is challenging because the programs have to be in place. There has to be, a baseline of training before coming in. But I think right now we're kind of evaluating where we are and then going around and looking at these universities and seeing if there's places where we're really missing an opportunity. So definitely at the recruiting level, we're looking into that at the university level, and we're even thinking about we're in conversations to set up a scholarship at Seattle University for an individual who would otherwise not be able to have that type of exposure. So definitely in the early stages of that, but it's one way that we're hoping to pull more folks in.
can also comment on that. So it's interesting to hear. In some ways, I'm sort of jealous of some of these like things that you guys were talking about from these big companies, like these programs you have, or setting up an internship or a scholarship. Again, like we're such a small company that, you know, we don't have like recruiting. Like if we think that we need a role, it's not necessarily, you know, like, oh, we have 5 open positions this year. How are we going to fill it? It's like, okay, what's our capacity? What projects are we working on? Where do we need to fill the holes within our company? And then historically, you know, we have to some extent been a part of the problem because we have a job description and then we send it out to people we know. And it's like, do you guys know anyone? And that's frankly how I think a lot of people get jobs in commercial real estate. So the last few rounds of hiring that we've gone through, we have also done that. We've also sent the emails out, but we've also, for the first time, really been like posting job openings and being a little bit more strategic about, okay, what communities are we accessing so that we can really reach a wider range of people, because it's really easy to just send an email to 20 people and say, here's the job description. Do you guys know anyone? And then, yeah, they do know someone, and then you hire them. And then it's just this like cycle of keeping the circle really closed. So for us, we're still trying to figure out, without this large infrastructure, how we can be better about accessing underrepresented communities.
Well, and one of the things I love about this panel is because you do represent a very diverse spectrum in terms of organizational size and structure. And no matter what your size, whether it's a small, medium, large, or supersized firm, everybody has a part to play. DEI isn't about any one person, it's about all of us. And again, a rising tide raises all ships. And so no matter the size of the organization, what each of you is really demonstrating and representing is that we all have a part to play. I know from DPR's perspective, we've really looked very deeply and richly at our talent acquisition processes and programs. And so, Dena, to your point, adding more HBCUs to our campus portfolio. But in addition to that, it's also saying, even if you're recruiting at a white majority campus, how are you engaging with diverse student populations on those campuses, because they do exist? Are you tapping into the diverse student unions and organizations that exist on those majority campuses? So there's a way to tap into talent, even if you're not necessarily recruiting at an HBCU or an HSI institution. There's also a huge movement happening, again, at firms of all sizes, really looking deeply and richly at job descriptions in terms of those things that actually require a degree, whether it's a 4-year, a master's, etc., versus something that requires experience, and really evaluating where the kind of inflection point exists between the kind of institutional education from a college versus practical application in terms of I've done it for the last X number of years. And a great example is there's data out there that says where degrees or where jobs require degrees, depending on the job, because again, there are some that do require those, but there are certain groups that then becomes a barrier. We said that not only with women and people of color, but we also see that with veterans. And so oftentimes you may have someone that's got 10, 15, 20 years of experience in the military doing a thing, but because they have not necessarily gone back and gotten their 4-year degree, they're not necessarily eligible for a particular role. And so a lot of companies are really evaluating what are those roles for which a 4-year degree is absolutely required versus those roles where, you know, having X number of years of that actual experience is more than sufficient, and if not preferable or desired. So there's lots of different ways to be able to approach the talent acquisition conundrum. We know there is a workforce shortage. And so starting earlier, and particularly when we're thinking about women in STEM programs and other underrepresented groups, the earlier we can educate people as to the opportunities that exist within and across the industry, the greater likelihood we have of attracting really, really top talent. Good to see everyone back. Thanks for the quick conversation at the tables. I'm looking forward to picking that back up, but I think we'll go ahead and regroup. I know which question I left off on, but I feel like there was something incredibly kind of profound and prophetic being said, and I just can't remember in the 5 minutes where we left off. So if the panelists are good, I'm going to kind of go to the next question. And again, if some epiphany comes up and you're like, oh, that's what I was about to say with the last question, please feel free to jump back in. So I'm going to go to Marie. What has been the reaction of leadership and staff to your DEI efforts within the workplace?
Yeah, so our leadership led the charge with the women's initiative that we had in our office. It was a really defined, established goal. And I think they engaged the staff to really kind of give them guidance, but it was definitely led by the leadership team here. And that had some great successes. As we continue with our DEI efforts, we're kind of starting back at the base, and we're right now we're trying to figure out what is the best way to engage with the staff. You know, there are a lot of women in our office, and so it was, you know, a group of 30 people who were coming together, and no one person was on the spot. I think as we tried to, you know, expand the energy to other underrepresented populations, we don't want to make anybody feel like they're on the spot, but we also know that we can't necessarily always see somebody's what somebody identifies with. It might not be something we're aware of from the outside, and so we don't necessarily want to also ignore people that we assume you know, fit into the mold when they don't necessarily, or they don't feel that there's a part of their identity that they don't feel fits into the mold. And so right now we're talking about kind of engaging the staff with a survey to sort of gauge where people are at, and kind of give that guidance back to sort of get to actionable items within the company. You know, we're doing this work outside the company, but ultimately we do want folks that are here to stay, and we want to retain them. And so that's the strategy that we're looking at right now to engage the staff.
Yeah, it's interesting as you were saying that. One of the things that was really resonating with me is, you know, anything in the change management spectrum can't be underestimated. And before transformation, there's socialization and communication. And so it must ring true and authentic for your folks internally in order for it to resonate externally. And so, you know, whatever's happening internally has to be congruent with what companies are saying externally. I know, particularly in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, a lot of companies were making public statements. And some of the commentary within the DEI community was, that's great, but I'm not necessarily sure that what we're saying externally is aligning with some of the things that are happening internally. And Marie, to your point, very similar to people with disabilities, 74% of all disabilities are invisible. And so people tend to look for those visible signs of what diversity might be. And so specifically, it may be gender or racial and ethnic diversity. But the reality is, I'm not different from you, I'm different like you. And that those differences are made up of a broad spectrum, a kaleidoscope of things that make us who we are. And so at the organizational or even public level, people are only really oftentimes seeing the tip of the iceberg, as they say. There's so much happening below the surface. And in order for people to feel like they can truly be their best authentic selves, we need to recognize those things that exist below the surface, which is not without its own set of challenges. So with that in mind, and this is for the group, specifically within the context of the last 18 months, when you think back, particularly post, you know, we went into a pandemic, then we had the murder of George Floyd and global social unrest as it related to racial and social injustice. And then we went into certainly a hotly contested political season. When you think about everything that has transpired in the last 18 months, as it pertains to your DEI efforts, because there's so much to unpack there, but as it pertains to DEI efforts, what do you wish you had known then that now, having had the last 18 to 20 months under your belt, what do you wish you had known at the start or continuation of your journey? Because all of your organizations started DEI work prior to the last 18 months. But what has this really shown to you that you wish you had known then?
I can speak to that. For me personally, I feel like with the death of George Floyd, you know, it happened to all of us, right? But I feel like we put our Black colleagues and friends sort of center stage and said, you know, speak for your community, you know, and when I look back, it really wasn't fair. It was a stressful time for everybody. I think that we needed to have a little bit more empathy, to our Black colleagues, instead of like saying, you need to speak and you need to teach us. I think we needed to take some responsibility ourselves to learn about it, to educate ourselves, take that responsibility and not just put it onto the people who are affected the most by it, asking them for answers. It kind of, I heard that a lot from my Black colleagues. I didn't really understand it until I think the Asian hate crimes started surfacing, and I was getting these weird messages. And I mean, it was great. I mean, I thought it was nice that people were acknowledging that this was happening, but it was also stressful personally. And I feel like I was like, oh, this is, we need to be a little bit more empathetic to everybody, to what everybody's going through. So that's just my little 2 cents on that.
Yeah, I think kind of in the same vein, there was a lot of energy last June after George Floyd. But I think it's really important to always remember that it's a marathon and not a sprint, that this is long-term work. Often it's going to be generational work to achieve the outcomes that you're hoping for. And, just echoing your point, Dena, when there was so much energy and everyone wanted to solve the problem now, it really did unfairly impact those who were probably having the hardest time processing and just, coping with the news every single day. And so I think it is incumbent upon the rest of us to always to have it ingrained in our DNA and always be working towards a better outcome and knowing that the target is going to keep moving and it should keep moving. What defines success today is going to be different from what defines success 10 years from now. And I think keeping that in the back of our mind is very important.
Well said. So with that, I guess in the same vein of that question, if there was one thing you could do differently, like if you could turn, what's the Cher song, If I Could Turn Back Time? If I could turn back time, what's the one thing that you would do differently if you had a chance to just approach the work all over again, specifically thinking about the last 18 months? Is there anything as you sit here today that you're like, if I could reapproach that differently, knowing what I know now, I would do X? Cait, I'm going to go to you first, and then Marie, Dena, feel free.
Yeah, a lot, probably. I mean, and it's one thing for me to judge it myself and for our company, and I'm sure there's other people that would judge me and our company differently too, right? So I think there are a couple sort of bigger picture things and then a few really or one or two specific things. And I was thinking as Marie was speaking, a lot of what I think the last 18 months was a lesson for me personally, maybe I'll say that, in terms of humility. And we felt pretty proud of the work that we had done around economic empowerment and supporting small businesses. So there was a little bit of like, oh no, but like, we're the good guys. Like, what are you talking about, right? So I think we've had to really I've had to stop and listen and think about not just bringing my own like chip on my shoulder about like, here's what we've done and, you know, here's what we've been doing over the last 10 years, and take a pause and listen a lot of it more. So I think that's definitely been a reflection over the last 18 months specifically. And then I'll let somebody else talk, but then I also have more ideas too, so.
Go ahead, Cait. Ideas are welcome. So
Sorry, I was struggling to unmute myself. So, you know, we got these questions beforehand. And so some of my ideas specifically were not so much about the last 18 months, but just like we were kind of starting from scratch. And one of my own sort of personal, I guess, the sort of a hill that I will die on, I guess, is gender neutral parental leave policies, for example, right? I think that's a big deal. And if I could wave a magic wand, I would sort of make every company across the board, big, small, do take, you know, sort of, I don't know if you can force people to take parental leave, but to really have like a really robust gender neutral parental leave policies. And not just when it comes to like, maybe we call it more generous leave policies in general, right? Whether that's to deal with a family or to deal with a child or to deal with an aging family member or to be able to take sort of a mental health break. Like when we look at leadership and we look at specifically women in leadership, it's impossible to ignore the impacts I think that children can have on people's careers. So that was one of the things that, you know, if I could wave a magic wand and do things differently, it would be that. So I know I'm kind of shifting the conversation a little bit from specifically the last 18 months, but I think that is something that is important, but also really hard to figure out. Like, again, not to go back to the small company, big company, but we're a small company. So if someone leaves for 5 months, we got to figure that out. And there's a lot of emphasis on how we as a company can figure that out. But I think that's something that is really important long term. I'd be curious too to hear from Marie about how discussions around the parental leave came up in your women's group and, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can jump in.
Topic a little bit. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that.
No worries. Because this was a big topic for us. This was probably the sort of like the main thing that we adjusted. And you know, the women at CPL at the time were none of them had. I think we have one person who had children at the time, but we had a lot of younger employees that were looking into their future and saying, well, I only see one example of this being successful. What does that mean for me? Is this really the right place for me? And, you know, it's almost exactly what you said. What shook out of it was a gender neutral parental leave policy, because ultimately it was like, well, there are a lot of men in our office who have kids and young kids, and why can't they be examples of taking time off for your young family? And so ultimately that's what happened, is we sort of expanded our parental leave policy for men and women. And so, I mean, for the first several years, it was men who were using it. And you know, now it's a little bit of a different story, but, you know, for the longest time, it was brought up by women, but men were the one who used it. And then that makes it, you know, the more people who engage and participate, it makes it better and okay for everyone else to do it as well. So it's interesting that you brought that up, because that was definitely one of the topics that shook out of that initial discussion.
Well, and it's interesting, we actually find that with gender neutral benefits or policies, the statistics say that one of the most important things that organizations can do is have people that are actually going to model that desired behavior. Because even where organizations have gender neutral parental leave policies, as an example, what happens is there's still this unconscious bias that occurs that suggests men somehow should still not avail themselves of that. And so there's all kinds of things that still happen within workplace environments around both conscious and unconscious biases. And we'll stick to the gender neutral piece for this moment, but that how important it is for those behaviors, those desired behaviors, to actually be modeled, because we just see a disproportionate number of men not taking advantage of those, excuse me, parental leave policies where they do exist. And so seeing other leaders and managers and colleagues taking advantage of those policies encourages that desired behavior. So it's not just enough to have them, but to actually see people modeling utilization of those types of benefits and policies. So I'm going to go, I'm trying to monitor our time. I'm going to ask our behind the scenes folks to keep us honest. I think we've got about 7 minutes left. So I'm going to ask this to the broad panel because there's so much to unpack in this conversation. I feel we could probably go on another hour and touch on a whole host of other conversations. But if you had to boil it down to one thing that you really want people to take away from this conversation, again, lots of threads to be pulled on, but if there was one thing, again, if you're working for a small, medium, large, or supersized company, what's the one thing you want people to take away from this conversation that they can go back to their offices, to their colleagues, to their HR partners, and say this is something we should be thinking about or something we should be endeavoring to do? And I'm going to start with Dena and then work my way around. But again, what do you want people to take away from this conversation?
I think there's a couple of things. DEI, as we just kind of touched on, is not just ethnic. It encompasses so many things, and we need to look through that lens and really pick through and pay attention, right, to those differences that we have. Having conversations and being curious, and I don't know, I think we just need to understand each other better, and having those and making the time to have those conversations, I think, is really important. DEI is no longer voluntary, right? We need to, it needs to be addressed. It needs to be transparent. If your company isn't having the conversations, now is the time to start, because you're going to lose your competitive edge. Those companies that aren't moving the needle on DEI, they're going to be at a huge disadvantage. From an organizational point of view, communicate often and early, and talk about the initiatives that are happening and get people involved, because if people are involved, that will move the needle even further.
Marie?
Yeah, sure. I think, well, what I've learned from meeting with you all over the last week or so is that there's really not one definition for how to succeed in this space, and that there's different companies are going to have different strategies. And but I do think a lot of it starts with open communication and really having honest conversations, and kind of like what you were saying, Cait, you kind of have to enter with that, the chip off your shoulder. You have to sort of humble yourself to acknowledge that there's room for improvement, and then go from there.
Cait?
Yeah, I'm nodding along with what everyone is saying. I also don't necessarily know that like I'm in a position to be telling everybody what to do, because we're still very much figuring out. And I'm learning so much from this discussion and you guys. So thank you for that. I also, but now I'm going to go and tell people what to do, I guess, after saying that. But I think DEI cannot come from a place of altruism and like we're doing this because it's the right thing to do. Obviously, it is the right thing to do, but I think companies with more diverse leadership are more successful. And, not only do you have a competitive edge when it comes to hiring, but you have a competitive edge when it comes to running your company and being successful in whatever field you want to be in. Companies with more diverse boards and more diverse leadership, just across the board, are more successful because you're avoiding an echo chamber. And I think when you have people that look the same and think the same running a company, you just hear what you want to hear. So it's not just about doing it, because we think it's the right thing to do. It's really about, can also be about the bottom line.
Well said, all of you. And I'll just add on to that. A couple of things really resonate with me. So it's maybe not just one thing, but a couple of things really resonate. Within the DEI space, there are 1,000 great ideas. There are 100 things that are important, but there's probably only a handful of things that are going to make a meaningful difference. And that it's really important for companies to focus, regardless of the size, is focus on the things that are going to make a meaningful difference within and across the employee experience and life cycle, as opposed to the 1,000 great ideas that might exist. So really think about those things that are going to be tangible and meaningful, and focus on the few that are going to create momentum. And I'll also say that I'm partial to the analogy, and someone said it earlier, that it's a marathon, not a sprint. People in organizations have to be invested for the long haul. If organizational transformation is occurring, that does not happen overnight. So resilience is absolutely essential. And that said, while it's important to meet people where they are, you don't have to stay there. So at some point as an organization, if that is your value proposition, then you have to keep moving forward with that value proposition. You always want to, again, meet people where they are, but you don't have to stay there. Keep moving forward. And so with that, I see Greg has rejoined us. I'm just going to thank all of our amazing panelists, Cait, Dena, Marie. You all have been amazing. Thank you for your time, your energy, and your insight. It has been an absolute pleasure. Greg, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Stacey, and thank you, everybody. And thank you again to our panel here for their insight and discussion, as well as the DEI committee for hosting our roundtable series. A recording of this webinar will be available to NAIOP members. Some housekeeping before we begin our networking portion. You can view all attendees present on the right sidebar. To privately message an attendee, click their icon and choose direct message. Please take a seat at any open table to network. Your video will not start until there are at least 2 people seated at a table. To optimize your networking experience, we recommend you visit multiple tables. As a reminder, our speaker panel and DEI committee members will be seated throughout the lounge, ready to connect with attendees. We welcome your thoughts and reflections. Please enjoy the networking.